I couldn't believe what I was reading. My own name, printed in glittering announcements and whispered across elite circles, accompanied by words that made my blood run cold. Dead. Supposedly, I had passed away, vanished from this world, and he, my ex, was basking in the sympathy, the admiration, the instant social clout it earned him. I stared at my phone, the screen trembling in my hand, replaying the messages over and over, trying to convince myself it was some cruel joke, a mistake, anything but the truth. How could someone I had loved, someone I had trusted, use my very life as a stepping stone to impress others? The sheer audacity left me reeling. My chest tightened, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and humiliation swirling together. I could feel the heat of betrayal burning through my veins. Everything we had shared, every vulnerable moment, twisted into fuel for his grand performance. The whispers, the admiration, the champagne toasts. They were all built on my supposed absence, my erasure, my silence. And the worst part? No one questioned it. Everyone believed him. Everyone mourned me. My mind raced. How had I been so blind? How had I never suspected that beneath his charm, beneath his carefully curated smiles, lay a man capable of weaponizing the person who trusted him most? I wanted to scream, to shatter every glass at his parties, to confront the people who had celebrated my non-existence. But even that impulse couldn't mask the deeper pain, the realization that I had been erased, reduced to a story, a prop in his relentless climb. The humiliation wrapped around me like a suffocating cloak, yet beneath it simmered a fire I hadn't felt before. If he thought this would break me, he was gravely mistaken. I would rise, quietly at first, rebuilding myself in the shadows, until the moment came when he would see exactly who he had betrayed. My fury sharpened with each passing second, and I swore, in the deepest corners of my mind, that the world would one day know the truth. They didn't know who they were messing with. After the shock of learning he had claimed I was dead, the world felt hollow and strange, like I was walking through someone else's life. Friends I had counted on vanished, offering condolences to him instead of checking on me, and family members whispered around empty chairs as if I had truly disappeared. For a while, I let the silence swallow me, retreating into a modest apartment far from the city's glittering parties and elite circles. I changed my routines, avoided familiar streets, and built a life in shadows, where no one could remind me of the betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. Each morning, I reminded myself that survival mattered more than recognition. Slowly, painstakingly, I began carving out small victories. A new job, quiet friendships, and moments of genuine laughter untainted by pretense. But even as I rebuilt, I couldn't stop watching him. Social media, mutual acquaintances, and the whispers that reached my ears painted a picture of a man soaring higher than ever, celebrated for a life I had lived, praised for charm I had nurtured, all on the foundation of my supposed death. FOMO gnawed at me. The longing to reclaim even a fragment of what he had stolen was constant, simmering beneath the surface. Every gala, every exotic vacation he flaunted, every lavish dinner I saw in photos was a reminder of the status he seized, the admiration he borrowed from my existence. I wrestled with jealousy, disgust, and disbelief, but it also stoked a determination I had never felt before. If he could build an empire on lies, I could dismantle it with the truth. As I observed him, I started mapping his weaknesses, noting the cracks in his charm, the moments when arrogance overshadowed competence, the subtle insecurities behind his perfectly staged smiles. In isolation, I grew sharper, more patient, more methodical, understanding that this betrayal, though painful, could be turned into power. I learned the art of quiet resilience, to be invisible yet vigilant, ignored yet unstoppable, content yet ready to strike. That balance became my new life, my secret advantage. I was no longer just the victim in his story. I was the shadow he never saw coming, watching as the world cheered for the lie he created, while I prepared the moment when reality would finally catch up to him. From the safety of my quiet life, I watched him move through the world I had once shared, and it made my stomach twist with a mix of disgust and burning fury. He arrived at glittering galas draped in tailored suits, every movement calculated to impress, every smile a performance. The cameras followed him. The champagne flowed endlessly, and the whispers of admiration floated around him like a carefully orchestrated halo. I saw him laugh with people who had never known me, people who praised him for the very life he had stolen from me. At charity balls, he held court as if the world revolved around him, handing out compliments and handshakes like currency, while I remained invisible, a ghost in the background. Every display of luxury, a new car parked at the valet, a private jet landing on a pristine runway, a sparkling necklace catching the chandelier light, was a dagger twisted in my chest. Yet, as much as it angered me, it also illuminated the hollowness beneath the glamour. He had built an empire of appearances, fragile and shallow, dependent entirely on deception and social performance. I saw the fake laughter, the discreet glances that revealed envy and uncertainty, and I realized that beneath the gold-plated smile was a man terrified of exposure. The more I witnessed, the more my anger evolved into motivation. Each party, each toast, each congratulatory message he received became fuel for the fire I kept simmering within. I could see him in all his superficial grandeur, and in that clarity, I began crafting my strategy. I would not confront him blindly, or with petty vengeance. I would dismantle the illusion carefully, ensuring that every observer who once cheered him would witness the truth, and in that revelation, he would finally face the consequences of his lies. The more I watched, the more determined I became. The facade might fool the world for a while, but I was patient, and patience, I knew, could be far more devastating than the most explosive confrontation. I started small because I knew rage could burn faster than I wanted to. At first it was practical things, opening a new bank account in my real name, taking a night shift at a bookstore so no one from that glittering world would see me, learning to answer questions without flinching. Each quiet victory felt like a stitch in a garment I was sewing to cover the rawness inside. But sewing wouldn't be enough. I needed a pattern, a plan, and patience. I mapped his calendar in my head. Charity galas and society auctions, the names of people who fed him introductions, the dates when his arrogance would be most on display. If he was going to build a life on a lie, I would be the slow, precise force that unraveled it. At night, when the apartment was quiet and the city noise softened, I wrote lists. Not of grievances, I had those in abundance, but of leverage. Who owed him favors? Which investor had quietly worried after one too many mismanaged accounts? Who had a history with his past scandals, the kind the elite never wanted on record? I tracked dates, rumors, and the moments when his smile faltered in photographs. Gathering information felt less like vindication, and more like assembling safety for myself. Knowing the terrain calmed me. Knowledge was armor that made me feel less vulnerable and more purposeful. I met people I never would have before. A private investigator who owed me a favor from a kindness I had once shown. A retired journalist who liked to pull apart polished narratives and find the loose thread. An old colleague who knew how to dig through corporate filings. They were careful and skeptical, and liked me for reasons I understood. There was a truth to what I was doing, a methodical hunger that was hard to moralize. I paid them with cash from jobs where I wasn't asked about my past, and with the quiet steadiness of someone who needed results more than applause. Their small victories, a misfiled receipt found, a photo timestamp corrected, a phone log that contradicted his stories, became proof that the scaffolding of his life was not as solid as he presented it. There were nights when I almost gave up the plan. Anger is a heavy thing to carry alone. I missed being seen for who I was, without the heroics or the scandal. Sometimes, I wanted nothing more than to walk into his next party and slap the smile off his face, to expose him in a raw, breathless moment and let the world gasp. But those impulses were precisely why patience mattered. Public destruction could feel good for a moment and ruin me in the next. So instead, I practiced restraint, letting small, corroding actions do their work. A supplier quietly withdrawing, service, an offhand comment at a luncheon that seeded doubt, an anonymous tip that led a reporter to ask a pointed question. I also rebuilt the parts of me that had nothing to do with revenge. I took a pottery class and discovered I could shape something useful out of something raw and messy. I reconnected with a cousin who made terrible coffee and better conversation. I read books that reminded me there were lives beyond the ledger of status and spectacle. Those soft returns to myself were strategic as much as healing. The more whole I felt, the less his manufactured fame could unsettle me. Strength, I learned, was not always loud. It was steady hands and a clearer heart. Power reversal didn't feel dramatic in those months. It was a series of quiet wins. A person finally returning a call to an email I had slipped into the right inbox. A rumor corrected by a document tucked in an archive. A minor supplier refusing to provide services at the next gala. Each small refusal was a chink in his armor. I let those chinks show just enough to stir curiosity, but not enough to draw his attention. He toasted to my memory in front of mirrors I was not permitted to see, and I prepared, quietly, for the evening that would force his facade to finally crack. Even from a distance, I began noticing the little fractures in his carefully constructed world. At one gala, I overheard a supplier mutter under his breath about a delayed payment, a subtle eye roll that betrayed frustration behind the forced smiles. At another event, an investor hesitated before shaking his hand, a glance that spoke volumes about unease hidden beneath polite conversation. Every interaction, every carefully choreographed smile he offered, started to feel brittle, as if the facade could crumble under the right pressure. His arrogance, once intoxicating to the people around him, now revealed a dangerous overconfidence. He assumed everyone would continue to admire him blindly. I saw the subtle ways he manipulated conversations, twisting facts and pretending generosity. But tiny inconsistencies began surfacing. An offhand comment that contradicted a previous boast. A detail about a charity donation that didn't add up. The elite who once flocked to his side no longer moved with total conviction. Curiosity, doubt, and quiet whispers now trailed him like shadows. Watching him falter in such minute ways fueled a growing satisfaction inside me, a sense that his empire was not as untouchable as he believed. I allowed myself a grim smile, knowing that these cracks were proof my plan could work. The suspense built like a slow drumbeat in my chest, anticipation coiling tighter with every small betrayal and oversight. The world would soon see the man behind the mask, and I would ensure the payoff was unforgettable, the humiliation precise, and the truth impossible to ignore. The envelope arrived in my mailbox like a challenge wrapped in gold foil and embossed with his monogram. At first, I stared at it for what felt like hours, my hand hovering over the card as if touching it would somehow summon the courage or caution I desperately needed. A luxury wedding invitation from the man who had claimed I was dead. My mind spun in conflicting directions. Part of me burned to storm in publicly, to watch the room collectively gasp as I stepped into the light, living proof of his deceit. Another part whispered caution, urging me to wait, to gather more leverage, to ensure the reveal would be perfect and unstoppable. I imagined the shock on his face if I simply appeared, the ripples it would send through the elite crowd, the subtle questions and surprised glances that could topple months of his carefully curated image. The tension was almost unbearable, every heartbeat a reminder of the power he had stolen, and the justice I longed to reclaim. I replayed the what-ifs in my mind endlessly. What if I confronted him privately? Would the immediate exposure feel satisfying, or would it give him a chance to twist the story, to regain some semblance of control before the witnesses could see the full truth? What if I failed to prepare for the eyes of the elite, the cameras, the whispered judgments of those who had been complicit in celebrating my supposed death? Every thought twisted inside me, anger and frustration mingling with a sharp craving for vindication. FOMO stung sharply. I had been erased from this world, left to watch as he soared, and now the universe had offered a ticket to his apex. Could I let it pass without making the moment count? Could I allow him the comfort of thinking he had finally won? I took a deep breath, imagining the wedding hall, the sparkling lights, the music, the laughter, and the toast he would make about his late love, none of it grounded in truth. My stomach churned, a mix of dread and exhilaration, knowing I held the power to shatter that fantasy with a single, carefully timed reveal. The invitation wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a door, and behind it lay the opportunity to reclaim not only my story, but the control he had so audaciously taken from me. In that moment, I realized that every carefully measured decision would matter. The choice between subtle sabotage and explosive exposure would define the entire arc of my revenge, and I was ready to walk through that door with a strategy as precise as my anger. The moment I stepped into the ballroom, I felt like a ghost walking through a world I had once been part of but was now entirely separate from. Crystal chandeliers glittered above, casting fractured light across tables draped in silk and overflowing with flowers that seemed almost too perfect, too staged. Guests floated in designer gowns and tuxedos, laughing and clinking glasses, their chatter punctuated by subtle glances at the man of the hour. Every smile he offered was precise, every handshake calculated to convey charm, wealth, and control. From the outside, he was untouchable, a figure wrapped in perfection, the embodiment of success. And yet, as I watched, cracks began to show. His eyes flickered with tension when a longtime associate approached with a question he hadn't anticipated, his practiced laughter faltering for just a second. The staff moved around him with polite vigilance, a silent acknowledgement of his volatility beneath the public facade. He corrected small mistakes in hushed tones, muttered complaints to his closest confidants, and for a fleeting moment, I caught a glimpse of fear. Fear that his image could shatter if the wrong question arose, the wrong truth slipped out. I felt a quiet thrill as I realized that all the pomp and grandeur couldn't hide the fragility underneath. I floated through the crowd, noticing the minute details that exposed the difference between appearance and reality. The borrowed designer shoes that pinched, the forced laughter masking insecurity, the strained compliments that carried undertones of envy or caution. Each observation sharpened my resolve. I knew where the weak points were, where his arrogance left openings, where whispers could grow into doubt. The contrast between the spectacle he created and the man behind it fueled a mounting tension in my chest, a mix of anticipation, anger, and satisfaction. As the evening unfolded, I watched him toast friends and colleagues, projecting an effortless confidence that I knew was earned through lies and manipulation. The gap between his public image and the vulnerabilities I had learned to spot in private moments made me realize that this wedding was more than a celebration. It was an arena, a stage for the first act of the reckoning I had been patiently preparing. Every glass of champagne raised, every applause, every flattering remark only reminded me that the world was still blind to the truth, but not for long. I was ready to step from the shadows and watch the delicate balance of his empire start to tremble. I approached the edge of the crowd, watching him laugh with guests who believed every polished word he spoke. My heart pounded, but I held myself steady, letting the calm mask the storm of anger and anticipation inside. He didn't see me at first, too busy basking in the admiration he had manufactured from my absence. I let him enjoy the illusion for a few seconds longer, observing the way he moved, the slight tension behind his perfect posture, the tiny tells that revealed cracks even in a room full of enablers. Then finally our eyes met, and recognition sparked. A brief flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before he replaced it with his practiced charm. "Surprised to see you," he said, voice smooth, almost mocking. I smiled faintly, leaning into the tension. "I imagine you didn't expect me to attend," I replied, letting the words hang in the air. Around us, the chatter continued, oblivious to the undercurrent building between us. I noticed a few guests glance our way, sensing the subtle electricity, but not understanding its source. Every detail mattered: tone, posture, micro-expressions, all part of the silent chessboard I was now playing. We exchanged polite pleasantries at first, each phrase layered with double meanings and quiet barbs. "I've heard so much about your generosity lately," I said lightly, letting the word hang like a challenge. He faltered for the briefest instant, a micro-reaction I caught and stored. Each slip, each hesitation, each small overcompensation became ammunition, quietly undermining his flawless veneer. I let the conversation flow naturally, careful to appear casual while planting seeds of doubt and exposing tiny inconsistencies about past stories he had told publicly. Guests nearby picked up on subtle cues, a raised eyebrow, a knowing glance, and their attention slowly shifted. I made a subtle reference to a mutual acquaintance who had supposedly been impressed by his kindness recently, but I knew they had been misled, and the conversation gently corrected the record without appearing confrontational. It was delicious, watching the tiniest ripple of uncertainty appear across his expression. The power reversal had begun, quiet and almost invisible to everyone else, but I felt the thrill of control surge inside me. This was the first real step of reclaiming what he had stolen. I left the interaction with my composure intact, but inside, every nerve thrummed with anticipation. The audience around us didn't yet know what had shifted, but I knew. The cracks were spreading, and the house of cards he had built on lies was starting to teeter. Every carefully measured word, every subtle revelation, every glance meant that the moment of public exposure was inching closer. The game had begun, and this first contact confirmed it. I was no longer the invisible victim. I was a presence he couldn't ignore, a truth he couldn't spin, and the room, oblivious to the unfolding drama, would soon bear witness to his unraveling. I waited for the perfect moment, blending into the crowd while keeping him in sight, watching the careful mask of charm begin to falter. A group of high-status guests gathered near the balcony, glasses sparkling, conversation light and perfumed with ego. I approached casually, a soft smile masking the intensity beneath. In my hand, I carried a subtle but undeniable piece of proof, messages, documents, photos, that confirmed everything he had hidden. I let the first whisper slip as I handed it to a trusted acquaintance. "You might want to see this. It explains everything." Eyes flicked to me briefly, then to the evidence. A pause, a breath caught in the air, and then the quiet murmur began, growing like the first tremor of a storm. He noticed it immediately. His laughter stiffened, a forced edge creeping in, and his gaze darted to me with the kind of panic that only comes when someone realizes their world is starting to fracture. I stayed calm, casual, letting the weight of the documents do the work while the elite guests absorbed the truth in small, quiet steps. I didn't need to shout. I only needed to place the seed of doubt. As whispers spread, I observed the ripple effect, the subtle shifting of chairs, the interrupted conversations, the way a few heads tilted in disbelief. The people who had once hung on his every word now exchanged discreet glances, the first cracks of recognition forming in their expressions. He tried to recover, offering explanations that sounded rehearsed and hollow, but it was too late. The small murmurs had grown into questions, and questions were dangerous in this room. I felt a surge of satisfaction watching him struggle to maintain composure, the carefully constructed narrative he had built, now showing its fractures. Internally, I reflected on the months of preparation, the quiet patience, the observations, the collection of subtle details that had brought me to this point. It wasn't brute force or dramatic confrontation that had begun to dismantle him. It was strategy, restraint, and timing. Yet the emotional beat was unmistakable. The panic flashing across his features, the quickened pulse I could almost see in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw as he realized the facade was slipping. I allowed myself a private thrill, knowing that the momentary discomfort he felt was the first taste of the justice he had long evaded. By the time I stepped back, letting the evidence circulate naturally, the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter was quieter, the smiles more cautious, the confidence that once radiated from him now fractured into micro moments of doubt. The first public cracks had appeared, small but undeniable, and I sensed the anticipation building in the room, as if everyone were waiting for the next move. For the first time that evening, he was not in control, and the tension between appearance and reality hung thickly in the air. I had started the unraveling, and the evening's crescendo was approaching, one deliberate step closer to full exposure. The moment arrived with the precision I had been waiting for, a slow, deliberate crescendo that made every second stretch with unbearable tension. The music swelled in the grand ballroom, but I barely noticed it, my eyes locked on him as he smiled at the crowd, unaware of the storm about to descend. I stepped forward, every movement controlled, my heart beat a steady drum beneath my calm exterior. All eyes turned as I approached the center of the room, carrying the undeniable truth in my hand, the collection of evidence I had painstakingly curated over months. This was no longer subtle whispers or glances. This was the revelation that would leave no room for denial. I began speaking, my voice clear and measured, commanding attention without shouting. Ladies and gentlemen, there's something you should all know about the story you've been told. The room fell silent, the chandeliers reflecting anxious eyes and suspended champagne flutes. Gasps rippled through the crowd as I laid out the facts. The lies he had spun, the deception he had orchestrated, the audacity of claiming my death to elevate himself among you. Each piece of evidence was unveiled slowly, strategically, letting the tension build with every revelation. The whispers of doubt from earlier now erupted into audible murmurs, and I watched his perfect composure crack, his jaw tightening, his hands trembling ever so slightly. I recounted the months he had manipulated everyone, the parties, the social accolades, the praise built entirely on my absence and suffering. Guests leaned closer, eyes wide, as the full scope of his betrayal became impossible to ignore. I felt a rush of satisfaction, as elite acquaintances who had once admired him now questioned everything, their whispers like tiny hammers chipping away at his constructed empire. He tried to speak, to charm, to redirect attention, but every word faltered under the weight of documented truth and collective shock. For the first time that evening, he was no longer the center of control. He was exposed, vulnerable, humiliated. The power reversal was complete. I saw his friends glance at each other in disbelief, some shifting uncomfortably, others staring openly at him with a mix of pity and newfound caution. The crowd that had celebrated his deceit now reevaluated him in real time, and the status he had so arrogantly flaunted crumbled visibly. His arrogance, the very thing that had once elevated him, now magnified the magnitude of his downfall. I allowed myself a brief moment to absorb the scene, his forced smiles giving way to red-faced panic, the polite claps of some guests drowned by murmurs of outrage and disbelief. In that instant, catharsis washed over me. The months of planning, observation, patience, and quiet anger had converged into a single, irreversible moment of justice. I felt no gloating, only the calm satisfaction of truth prevailing over deception. The room itself seemed to shift, the air heavier with the recognition of his lies, the collective realization that the man who had claimed my death to impress them was not who they had believed. And through it all I remained present, grounded, finally visible, a living, breathing testament to resilience and vindication. The finality of exposure resonated deep within me. His empire of illusion lay in pieces around him, his social armor shattered, and I stood as both witness and architect of the reckoning. Every heartbeat in the room echoed with the moral clarity of the moment. The whispers, the shocked glances, the subtle shifts in posture, all of it confirmed the reversal I had meticulously orchestrated. For the first time since the lie began, I was no longer erased. I was seen. And the world, or at least this room, had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. The room buzzed with stunned murmurs as the initial shock settled into whispered conversations. Guests exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. Disbelief, pity, curiosity, and the quiet satisfaction of witnessing truth triumph over pretense. Some avoided him entirely, moving through the space with polite smiles that barely masked judgment. The friends who had once toasted his name now spoke in hushed tones, recounting the revelations, and each retelling chipped away at the image he had painstakingly built. Even the staff, long accustomed to catering to his whims, seemed to regard him differently, their gestures now tinged with subtle distance and newfound respect for the reality behind the performance. He tried to salvage his composure, offering forced apologies and explanations, but the veneer had shattered irreparably. Invitations to future events were questioned. Whispered rumors spread to social circles he had once dominated, and even minor business associates began reevaluating alliances. I could see the subtle panic flicker across his eyes as he realized that status, wealth, and charm could no longer shield him from consequences. It was a slow unraveling, precise and inevitable, and I felt a quiet, deep satisfaction in watching it unfold.